One of the things I aim for in the course is to try to show students in ways as concrete and rich as I can what the authority or power of movies in a cultural moment might be. And I try to give them some examples of that. In my first lecture, I sometimes read to them from a passage from James Agee's novel, A Death in the Family. In the very beginning of that novel, he describes beautifully an excursion between a father and son going to see a Chaplin comedy in 1915 in some southern city. And what he describes is what a social occasion it was, what a moment of bonding it was for father and son, what a cultural moment it was more broadly for the whole of the population that went into the theater to laugh uproariously at Charlie's shenanigans. And then the screen was filled with a city and with a sidewalk of a side street of a city and a long line of palms, and there was Charlie. Everyone laughed the minute they saw him squatly walking with his toes out and his knees apart, as if he were chafed. Rufus's father laughed, and Rufus laughed too. This time Charlie stole a whole bag. This time, what does that imply about the audience? An intimate familiarity with previous adventures of this character, right? An ongoing, routine connection. This time he caught a sight of, this time Charlie stole a whole bag of eggs, and when a cop came along, he hid them in the seat of his pants. What it showed was the cultural embeddedness of movies, even in their earliest days, in the society and in the life of individuals. So part of what I mean by the power of movies and what I try to encourage the students to see is something of this anthropological energy as well as its artistic power as a representation of human experience. That the way these kinds of stories permeated the society helped to shape Americans' understanding of their natures, of what the social fabric was like, of what masculinity was, of what femininity was, of what families were, of what the relations among the races were, of what American history was, about what the founding story of America is, about what the central organizing values of our culture are. All of those things are dramatized either explicitly or implicitly in movies. And because the movies were so central through the 20th century, they were one of the central ways in which the belief system, the values of American society were promulgated, dramatized, rehearsed, and in some ways altered and changed. A related matter that connected again to film in part as an anthropological or sociological phenomenon, not simply an artistic one, as a social practice in a way, has to do with the power and role of genre in movies, which is a recurring theme in my course. Because we use genre in American society. I think all cultures do this, but we've made particularly rich and cunning use of genre in American society in many media, but especially in film. And if you look at particular long-lived genre like the Western or the detective story or the domestic melodrama, over time, what you, of course, can recognize are changing cultural and social attitudes. So the Western has become a screen on which America's anxieties about the Vietnam War have been projected. Why would the Western work so well for this? One answer is what I've been saying all along about the power of genre and the power of repetition. Look, if a thing is repeated again and again and again, it looks familiar. When it's so familiar, what happens? It licenses something disturbing because the genre seems on the surface to contain so many familiar reassuring elements. Those very elements of reassurance enable the exploration of disturbing or uncertain or problematic materials. And that's one of the and of course, because not any one of these films would have nothing like the power they actually have if they existed individually. But it's because they're part of this long conversation that goes back to the earliest days of movies that they have the power that they have. One of the functions of genre is one of the deep subjects of my course. And I want students to see how centrally variations in genre forms can reflect social and historical realities. And you can feel this in every film. You can feel this in every television program. If you look at American television from the 1950s to the 90s, let's say you restricted yourself to situation comedy, what do you think you would see? You would see a drama in which the American family undergoes profound change. What happens? Women become more important. patriarchal values become less and less powerful. Children become more respected, are treated less like appendages to the family. Some of them, and in some, by the 80s and 90s, sometimes the children have more dominant roles than the adults, and are often even shown to be wiser than their parents, right? Something that would have been impossible in the early 1950s, a more patriarchal era, when the classic television program about families was called Father Knows Best. Another spine question or organizing key question in the course is deeply literary for me. In other words, what I try to do here is encourage the students to develop what I'll call an aesthetic sense, to begin to have confidence when they say that's a good film or that's a bad film. I think that's a good movie, I think that's a bad movie, I think that's a good, and what I try to tell them is that judgment, good or bad, isn't merely subjective. It isn't just what you feel, right? That there may be potentially objective standards by which we can judge the excellence of texts. Part of it may remain subjective, but we can still judge excellence when we see acting. We can judge excellence when we ask how well the film is edited. We can judge the excellence of various aspects of the film. Teaching students how to do that and to distinguish between effective and ineffective uses of the medium turns out to be not simply a skill that you give to students who are watching movies. It's a skill you can give to students who read poems, who read books, who go to plays. So one of the central principles I try to teach them about this, how they can distinguish what I call a work of art from a mere entertainment, is what I call the multiplicity principle. And what I mean by the multiplicity principle is fairly clear, and I give many examples in the course. Essentially, it's the idea that what happens in a particular moment will have multiple functions. You won't just look at the scene in order to have the plot extended. The scene will also dramatize character. It will also tell you something about the atmosphere in which the character lives. Do you remember the moment in the passage I showed you from the De movie Umberto D, that very brief moment where we see a man get on a tram, a bus, and sit next to someone on the bus, and the bus moves. It's a completely wordless sequence, and there's a character we've never seen in the film before who sits down next to the protagonist. No words exchanged. When our protagonist gets up and gets off the bus, the camera lingers briefly on the man he'd left behind, and we see that man go like this. And what I suggested to you, again, I suggested that this was a moment of richness and complexity, of multiplicity in a way, because one implication of that scene was that the man, this stranger that we'll never meet again, that we only saw for one brief instant in the course of the film, might have concealed a story as deep, as rich, and as moving as that of our hero, Umberto D. When a moment contains multiplicity, when it does many things simultaneously, you're in the presence of a kind of excellence. That's only one principle, but it's a very valuable principle. And you can see its worth if you compare, let's say, a trivial or relatively banal form of action entertainment, on the one hand, with a movie that has complex characters in it. And you can see the different kinds of demands. Or even that a serious action-adventure film, a film that incorporates action-adventure elements in it, but also has a serious subject matter, to ones that don't. Let's say Kurosawa's samurai movies against the trivial, merely entertaining samurai movies that weren't interested in history or character, right? What you try to do is give the students a greater and greater sensitivity, not just to the particular text that exhibits such excellence, but you want to arm them so that when they encounter things on their own, they'll be able to make this judgment. A second aspect of this excellence, this what I call artistic quality, is the quality of organic form. I talk about this again and again in the course and try to show them instances of it. At its simplest level, the term, of course, derives from Coleridge, who borrowed it from the German Romantics. But essentially, it's the idea that every text should generate a form that is unique to its needs. Form should be, in other words, you should not have a prior form into which content is poured, right? The form of the text, the shape of the text, should take its nature from the meaning of the text, from what the text is saying. And if you think about the structure of modern times, you'll see that it's a marvelously distilled instance, a marvelously clear instance of the principle of organic form. What happens to Charlie serially is more meaningful in a way than what happens to him in a single episode. And the fact that we have this sense that things are repeating, that Charlie's on a treadmill, that he lives a cyclical life, that he'll always have moments of hope and hopelessness, that he'll have momentary times when he's when he finds a place to live or finds sufficient food, but that it will always be temporary, that his life is always on the road, that his life is always in process. And that at the same time he never lets himself completely despair. There's always a moment where his resilience reasserts itself. Well, those elements are embedded in some sense in this very structure, the very organization of the film. There should be a symbiotic relationship, a marriage, a linkage between form and content, between the shape of the text, between the strategies and techniques that are used to embody the story and what the story says. There should be a marriage between form and content. That's what organic form is. And if you can show students moments of organic form, and if they can really recognize it, they are proof for life against banal art.